I'm excited to be joined today by Dr. Colin DeYoung. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota, where he runs the DeYoung Personality Lab. He's an expert in the psychology and neuroscience of personality. Colin, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks, Adam. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Let's compare and contrast what we mean by personality in the everyday sense, where we say, like, Colin is smart or hardworking or creative or whatever, versus how do you define that scientifically?
Well, in some ways, I mean, the examples that you just gave are actually pretty close to the range of things that we think of as constituting personality scientifically as well. I think maybe even a more common way of talking about people's personality when you say like, oh, he's got a good personality, then maybe people are thinking more specifically about certain kinds of social behaviors, and they might exclude something like intelligence. But in personality psychology, we really think of it pretty broadly as including all kinds of persistent individual differences in people's behavior and motivation and emotion and cognition. So it's really basically just describing anything that's persistent about our patterns of behavior and experience psychologically.
So this seems to be related to the philosophical is versus ought distinction. Like when we say someone has a good personality, we're talking about desirable traits, but when we're trying to describe personality scientifically, like there isn't necessarily better or worse. There's just individual differences, and maybe they all have their evolutionary niche.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between sort of ethical judgments of good and bad, and then risks for various kinds of problems that people can have. And I suppose anytime we're talking about problems in any sense, there's some kind of an ethical dimension involved. But for example, one of the things that we study is the degree to which different personality dimensions are involved in risk for different kinds of mental health problems. And so, yes, it's true that for any given personality trait, there's usually one end or the other that people in general tend to find more or less desirable. And so then we get into these issues of social desirability and either sort of formal or informal ethics. But we can also think about the ways in which people's personalities, cause trouble for themselves or present risks for various different types of outcomes.
And when we're talking about personality traits in your work, we're referring to the big five.
In my work, no, we would be referring to any kind of persistent difference in behavior or experience. And what's important about the big five is that they appear to basically describe the major dimensions of covariation among more specific personality traits. So this is a misconception that people often have who are in psychology, but maybe not as deeply immersed in personality psychology, that when they hear personality, they think, oh, that just means the big five. And like if I'm studying something else, I've got a measure that tracks differences in people's, level of empathy or narcissism or whatever it is that people are interested in from a scientific perspective. They'll say, oh, well, that's not personality because it's not the big five, but that's actually not the way that it works. All of these things, as long as they describe persistent patterns in people's behavior and experience, can be described as personality traits. But the way in which they tend to appear together within people is what is described by the big five.
Mm-hmm. So there's a question of, are these traits like really real things that actually exist versus are they just capturing something statistically that's like covariating?
Well, I'm not sure that I know the difference between those two options, because I would say exactly the real thing that exists is the tendency for certain patterns of behaviors to co-occur within individual people. Right. So just to give you an easy example, people who tend to talk more also tend to be more sociable, also tend to experience more positive emotions, also tend to be more physically active. These things just tend to co-occur within people. And so you've got people who are high in all those things and people who are low in all of those things. And if we just look at the average, we see that those things tend to be correlated. And of course, that cluster of traits is what we label as extraversion. Mm-hmm. And so extraversion is real in the sense that it describes a real pattern of co-occurrence of features of people. And then I think that the additional question that we want to ask is what causes that pattern of co-occurrence? And that's where we get into a lot of the things that my work focuses on. So a lot of people who study personality have traditionally studied it in terms of what kinds of outcomes do personality differences predict. So if we've got the big five, we can say, well, what is being high or low in extraversion or high or low in conscientiousness? What does that lead to? What kind of outcomes does it predict? I've always been interested in going the other direction causally and thinking about, well, where do these particular patterns of behavior come from in the first place?
Right. And personality neuroscience is a very new field, right? You're at the forefront of this.
Yes, I mean, so in some way, the main reason that it's new is just that the technology to research it effectively has not existed for very long. But we can really go back to the middle of the last century, and probably Hans Eysenck could be considered the father of personality neuroscience. He wrote the first book about the neurobiology of personality. But at the time, the tools for studying it were relatively unsophisticated, and so it's really with the rise of computing power, but also neuroimaging like MRI machines that we can start to do hopefully a better job of getting at these questions.
Before we get to the causes and predictions, could we go over each of the big five traits and talk about them in a bit more detail?
Yeah, of course. So I've already mentioned extraversion. And so that's this general tendency to be assertive and enthusiastic, sociable, experience positive emotions, more active versus being quiet, reserved, submissive. I don't know, maybe for each one of them, I'll also just briefly say what our theoretical understanding of the basic psychological mechanism is that's involved. So extroversion seems to be fundamentally a function of people's sensitivity to reward. So the reason that people are more talkative, more assertive, experience more positive emotions is that they're more sensitive to the possibility of things being rewarding, and then to the actual sort of experience of positive emotions when some kind of goal is attained. The complement to extroversion would be neuroticism, which neuroticism is an old label with a lot of baggage associated with it. People often think of Freud when they think about neurotic people, but in current personality psychology, it just refers to the tendency to experience all different kinds of negative emotion. And so, unfortunately, it turns out that if you are prone to being anxious and sad, or depressed, or irritable or angry, that unfortunately you're probably prone to experiencing these other negative emotions as well. They tend to cluster within people. Mm-hmm. And that is associated with sensitivity to threat and punishment. And that's some of the best associated neural correlates in personality that we can talk about, is links between neuroticism and
it sounds like they would be a trade-off between threat and reward sensitivity, but you can be high in both or low in both, right? They're independent.
Yes, that's correct. So there are separate systems in the brain that process responses to reward and responses to threats and punishments. And so people who are high in both extroversion and neuroticism, they tend to be sort of an emotional roller coaster, right? Because 1 minute they're really excited about something, the next it's too overwhelming, and they're abandoning their plans because they're feeling threatened about it. That's why it's important to remember that these personality traits refer to general tendencies, right? When we say that somebody's high in neuroticism or high in anxiety, we're not saying that they're feeling anxious at every moment of every day. We're saying that they're likely to be more anxious in more situations than a person who is low in neuroticism or low in anxiety. So they're probabilistic concepts.
And there's a temptation to say, I want to be more extroverted and less neurotic, but there must be some benefit to the reverse, right? If you're thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective.
Well, I think first it's important to distinguish between an evolutionary perspective and a personal perspective. Evolution doesn't care whether we're enjoying ourselves as long as we're reproducing effectively. And so, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, there is a reason to be more sensitive to threat, especially if you're in a dangerous environment. There are some great studies, evolutionarily minded studies of other species that look at personality differences. So there's some like a model system with particular species of fish. And people have looked at the degree to which they vary in a dimension of sort of boldness versus timidness. And what you see is that if you're in an environment with a lot of predators, then the timid little fish do better and reproduce more because they're sensitive to threat, so they're not getting eaten as much. Whereas the bold ones are, being too exploratory and getting eaten. Whereas if you're in an environment with relatively few predators, then the bold fish start reproducing more because they're acquiring more resources and more mating opportunities. So yes, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, one good way to think about personality differences is in terms of these kinds of trade-offs.
Do you know if there's any research on whether introverts did better at coping during isolation and COVID?
Yes, in fact, there is, and they did. So the people who had the largest declines in in subjective well-being over the pandemic were people who are high in extraversion, to some extent high in openness as well, but especially the extroverts were really suffering from the lockdowns and the social isolation and the inability to get out there and explore behaviorally.
That's good to know. Okay, so there's 3 others, yes? You hinted at one of them.
So we've gotten through extraversion and neuroticism. Conscientiousness is another one, and this refers to people's tendency to be self-disciplined, organized, capable of pursuing long-term goals effectively or following abstract rules. And then, of course, the opposite there is being distractible, being disorganized, being impulsive.
This is another one that seems morally tainted, because you might be thinking, why shouldn't I be more conscientious? And why wouldn't you always want that?
Well, and why wouldn't you want to be more conscientious? So there are studies done of people's interest in changing their own personality, and it turns out that just about everyone has at least one personality trait that they would like to change. And certainly conscientiousness is one of the most common traits that people would like to change. Usually people want to be more conscientious and less neurotic. And who can blame them, right? And so, I think it's important to distinguish between these things that have relevance for people's daily functioning, as opposed to a moral judgment, right? If I say many people would like to be more conscientious, it's not necessarily because I think that it's ethically or morally better to be more conscientious, but it does make it easier for people to accomplish their goals, typically, if they are more conscientious. So by their own standards, they will often be interested in becoming more conscientious. Of course, there are these trade-offs again. So with most of these personality dimensions, one end of the dimension is associated with more risk for various forms of psychopathology, behavioral problems. But the other end usually has at least some risk associated with it as well. And the high end of conscientiousness is associated with the risks for problems related to compulsivity. Things like the tendency to be, rigidly perfectionistic or a workaholic to the extent that it interferes with people's relationships.
So most people would say they want to be more conscientious, but not like overly so to the point that you have OCD. But then would you say that maybe from an evolutionary perspective, an advantage to low conscientious would be like, you want to be as lazy as you can be and expend as little energy as you can be, as long as it's still good enough to survive and reproduce?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, I think, because of course there's also the fact that you want to maintain a healthy body, and we've evolved for our bodies to expect a certain amount of exercise. Right? So the fact that we're sitting in front of desks all day to do our work is probably actually not improving our quality of life, even though it may mean that we're expending less energy than somebody would say in a hunter-gatherer society. So you have to think about kind of what are the evolved expectations of the organism in terms of its behavioral diet, as it were. But of course, sure, just ceteris paribus, of course, it's better if organisms can preserve energy to use on things that are most important for increasing fitness. And there again, when we say better, of course, we don't mean that in any kind of evaluative sense, because evolution isn't a matter of ethical judgments. It's just that if the more energy you can save I don't have to tell you this, of course, right? That the evolution is just a matter of statistics. So the more things reproduce, the more they exist, the more there will be, the more they'll share those characteristics of the things that we're good at reproducing.
Two more traits.
Agreeableness is basically a description of a collection of all personality traits that are related to or reflecting altruism and cooperation. Right? We're an intensely social species. We have to get along with other people in order to function, but it's kind of an open question how much you need to take into account other people's goals and desires in order to do well for yourself. It's easy to analyze this one in terms of evolutionary perspective, right? Because within any kind of a social species, you have to, the coherence of the social group is useful for the survival and reproduction of those individuals within the group. But then there's also potentially room for competition between members of the group. So you need enough cooperation basically to keep the social system functioning properly. But then there's also room for some animals within the group to have a higher access to resources and mates than others. And so there's always the question of, how altruistic and cooperative should you be? And we can obviously see a very wide range in terms of those characteristics in human beings. Some people are very compassionate and polite and non-aggressive and would never take advantage of other people. Other people are exploitative and pushy and belligerent and rude and aggressive. So that's one useful spectrum of behavior to think about.
Do you know Abigail Marsh's work on empathy and altruism?
Yeah, to some extent, I do.
I asked her about that, about what predicts empathy and altruism, and I was asking her to what extent is this overlapping or the same thing as personality trait agreeableness, and she seemed convinced that they're actually quite independent. So that if agreeableness is more about emotion and desire to please, but it's not necessarily altruistic in the sense of like self-sacrifice.
No, not at all. That's a misunderstanding of the Big Five. So the important thing to remember about the Big Five is that you can't judge what the Big Five are by, let's say, a few items from a single brief questionnaire measure of the Big Five. The Big Five are fundamentally these latent dimensions that are discovered. They're not theoretical. They're not something that people came along and said, well, what would be the important elements of personality? They're discovered by putting essentially, as many different personality measures or descriptors as you can think of into a factor analysis and looking to see what are the major dimensions of covariation among those traits. So traits reflecting altruism and empathy are some of the best markers of agreeableness. So they're not identical to agreeableness because agreeableness is broader than that. But they are certainly important components of agreeableness. And I would argue that tendencies toward altruism and cooperation in terms of underlying mechanisms are basically the core of what drives agreeableness.
And most other personality theories are very theoretical and not just like generated statistically, and then only later do you look at it and try and tell a story around it, right?
Yeah, I mean, although that kind of that begs the question: what personality theories are we talking about? Right? There have been various personality theories over the decades, over a century now since personality theories first started appearing, and so yeah, many of them have been purely theoretically driven. But if we actually look at what is influential now in personality psychology, I can think of theories of relatively specific domains of traits, but I can't really think of broad theories that people are focusing on that are independent of these large empirically derived trait taxonomies. Maybe I'm just overlooking something. I'm trying to think. If we go back to the 80s, there was a theory by Robert Cloninger that had this kind of theoretically driven flavor, where he basically took the major neurotransmitters and said, well, what should be the personality trait that would be associated with each one of these neurotransmitters, and then developed personality questionnaires and theories based on those kinds of ideas. The problem with that is that it turns out to be an overly simplistic approach to the neurobiology of personality, because it's not individual neurotransmitters are not simply linked to a single personality trait. They usually, given neurobiological parameters, are usually related to multiple traits, And any one of these broad personality traits is going to be a reflection of variation in multiple neurobiological systems.
The last one is openness.
Yes. And so openness has probably been the most controversial of the big five in terms of sorting out how to interpret it, how to label it over the years. I usually refer to it as openness/intellect because there's this long debate about, is it more about people's, well, inquiring intellect was one of the original labels for that dimension when it was discovered back in the 40s and 50s. Later on, people thought, well, it's not, it's more than just people's intelligence. It's more than just their intellectual curiosity. It's also about artistic interests and perceptiveness and imagination and creativity and maybe even the tendency to engage in fantasy. And so we need something that's a broader label. And so openness to experience was this alternative label that was developed. And that's what's kind of solidified as the most common label. But it turns out that this tendency toward intellectual interest, intellectual engagement, really is a core component of it and sort of ends up being about half of the broader dimension. And so you've got half of it that's more about openness to experience, this kind of perceptual engagement, perceptual interest, and then half of it that's more abstract and intellectual and based on this sort of approach to reasoning about information.
And all of these actually have a half and half sort of, right? You did some work breaking down the big five into like a big 10 where each one of them has two subscales. Yes.
So, and that brings up this important issue about personality models in general, which is that they're hierarchical. And so this is again the problem when people think, oh, the big five is just when we say personality, we mean the big five. Well, although the big five are good at capturing these major dimensions of covariation among lots of narrower traits, still it can sometimes be useful to study narrower traits because there may be important distinctions within these broader dimensions. So for example, instead of just focusing on the big five level of openness and intellect, we might break it down and study openness and intellect separately. Or in extraversion, it turns out there's a difference between being assertive and tending to take charge and be more prone toward leadership and activity versus being more enthusiastic and being more sociable and experiencing more positive emotion. And you can find people who are, with the same level of extroversion, one person might be highly assertive and relatively unenthusiastic, and the other person might be highly enthusiastic and relatively unassertive. And so there are these breakdowns of the big five into narrower, more specific narrow traits. And those are often called facets. And some of the early work that I did was basically looking to see if we can find empirical distinctions at these lower levels. Because most of the facet models of the big five that say, well, there are 6, subdimensions within each big five trait, or maybe there are 9, or there are 3. There are all these different models, but most of them are, rationally or intuitively derived rather than empirically derived. And so what I did was to take a pretty broad range of these narrower traits within each of the big five and factor analyze them and show that there were 2 major factors, subdimensions within each of the big five. And I was actually inspired to do that by a behavioral genetics study, which was looking at one of the commonly used big five instruments that breaks it down into facets and showed that you needed 2 genetic factors to account for the genetic covariance among those narrower traits. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's really interesting because, if there are multiple genetic patterns of covariation there, that seems to map onto that. At the time, it seemed to map onto some of the distinctions I had been observing, like reading the literature on these things. Like it seems like sometimes extroversion is more about this and sometimes it's more about that. And so basically, I was able to confirm that pattern that somebody had seen genetically in a larger set of specific facet level traits. And that led to this model that you're talking about, where there are 10 factors with 2 below each one of the big five.
Was that something that you restricted the factor analysis to, where you were looking for 2 factors within each trait? Or is that a coincidence that every single one broke down into 2 as opposed to staying as one construct or breaking down into 3 or 4 or more?
Yes, that's a great question, and one that I've been thinking about for the last almost 20 years now. First of all, I did not restrict the factor analyses. I used some of these empirical tests of how many factors there are within a covariance matrix and it consistently indicated 2 for the different big 5 dimensions. And so then I thought, well, maybe this is some kind of an artifact of social desirability, where maybe some facets are more desirable than others. And there were ways in our original research where I was able to kind of check on that, and that did not seem to be able to account for it. For a long time, I was thinking that potentially it had to do with the hemispheric lateralization, that you could think of, the bias of right hemisphere function being more toward, well, in general, I think right hemisphere function is more biased toward accommodative processes, and left hemisphere toward assimilative processes. But, and that worked well. That seemed to work well for several of the big 5, but not necessarily for all of them. But recently, I encountered a paper that was kind of building off of the personality theory that I had been developing. And let me see. I want to get his name right. Gary Hovhannissian and John Vervecchi produced a paper about something they called inactive big 5 theory. It's kind of building off my cybernetic big 5 theory. And they proposed something that I think is probably right, which is that even though the big 5 can be divided into the traits that are related to stability and the traits that are related to plasticity as higher order factors. And I think we haven't really touched on that yet, but I'll come back to it in a minute. Well, actually, basically at this point, I should just say that, so originally the big 5 were considered to be independent of each other, but that was mainly because the factor analytic methods that were used when it was first discovered forced the factors to be unrelated to each other. It forced orthogonal factors. And what people found as they started to work with the various instruments measuring the big 5 is that there is a regular pattern of correlation among the big 5, where extraversion and openness tend to be correlated with each other, and agreeableness, conscientiousness, and low neuroticism tend to be correlated with each other. Now, they're not extremely strong correlations, so it still makes sense to think about the big 5 as relatively independent, but they're not fully independent. They have some degree of tendency to co-vary, and so it's useful to think about these 2 higher order factors. And a lot of my work has been focused on trying to understand, are those factors real? Are they artifacts? Where might they come from? What might be responsible for that? But basically, the argument that Gary and John made was that the same underlying sort of functional properties that lead to have these 2 higher order factors of stability and plasticity can be applied to explain why there would be 2 factors within each one of the big 5. So in other words, even though you can separate the big 5 into stability and plasticity, this broader plasticity and stability dynamic still leads to different types of function that you could have that you see within each one of the big 5. And I'm happy to go into that in a bit more detail, but I think that that's the best hypothesis that I've encountered so far about why you might see exactly 2 subfactors within each of the big 5.
Yeah, I took your 10 facets test, and I found that I was relatively polarized within each of my traits. And I would encourage listeners to try it out too. I'll link your website and the test in the description of this episode. And maybe we can apply that stability plasticity theory on myself as a case study and figure out what that would say about me. So
sure.
Most people, well, I would call myself an introvert. Although looking at this podcast, people might not know that because it requires some level of outgoingness. And on the test, I scored much higher in assertiveness than enthusiasm. For openness, I scored much higher on intellect than the creativity dimension.
Well, I wouldn't call it creativity because scientific creativity in the domain of sort of ideas and logic is predicted by intellect, but not openness. And then creativity in the artistic domain is predicted by openness, but not intellect, if you use them as simultaneous predictors. So creativity actually sits kind of right dead center in the middle of that big 5 dimension. So the way that I label them in my test is as openness and intellect.
So if extraversion and openness, these together make the plasticity dimension in the
Right.
higher order thing, right? Okay, so is the me being higher in intellect than openness and higher in assertiveness than enthusiasm, is that consistent with what the stability plasticity correlation is?
Uh,
Obviously, there could be exceptions, so even if it's not, it doesn't
well, right. I
invalidate
mean,
the
that's
theory.
the important thing to remember is that again, these are traits are probabilistic descriptors, right? They're so when we say that somebody's high in extroversion, we don't necessarily mean that they're high in every sub feature of extroversion, and because they're not perfect correlations, you can find people who have different profiles at the lower levels of the hierarchy, just as the same way you can have differences at the big five level. And so the perspective that Gary and John brought to this would suggest that openness is actually the more, let's say, plastic subcomponent of openness and intellect is the more stable component. But the thing is, because they're both within a plasticity trait to begin with, they're both going to be relatively obviously connected to exploratory functions, right? So the idea is that plasticity refers to the ability to be flexible and exploratory, to be engaged with novelty and to develop new patterns of behavior and new patterns of thinking about things. And then stability refers to the capacity to maintain stable goal-directed functioning and avoid disruptions from various kinds of impulses or distractions.
So then within extroversion, assertiveness would be more stability and enthusiasm would be more exploratory.
Well, no, in fact, within extroversion, it's the other way around. So assertiveness is more exploratory because it's more related to incentive reward and the possibilities for new achievements, new acquisitions. Whereas enthusiasm is more about the positive emotion that we experience when we achieve something that we want or when we are in a place that is the way that we want it to be. And so that positive emotion then reinforces patterns of behavior. And this basic principle of reinforcement learning. It's like, why do you have positive emotions? It's so that you will do again the thing that made you feel good.
Oh, the reinforcement learning perspective makes sense to me, although it's still a bit surprising because I was imagining thrill seeking and enthusiasm being like the more exploratory thing, and then assertiveness being like sticking with your patterns in that very structured.
Well, it turns out that thrill seeking is pretty much intermediate between enthusiasm and assertiveness, right? So there's people who are high in the tendency toward thrill seeking or excitement seeking. They are basically equally prone to assertiveness and enthusiasm.
What are the two facets for conscientiousness?
For conscientiousness, we have industriousness and orderliness, right? And so orderliness is sort of, is maintaining the order of things, right? It's like minimizing entropy through things that we can control, like following rules. And those could be rules for behavior. They could be moral rules. They could be rules about the organization of my stuff. And then industriousness is basically the capacity to work hard to avoid distractions, to pursue longer term goals effectively.
I was higher in industriousness than orderliness, which I imagine might be common for academics.
Yes, that is the case. There are plenty of academics who get a lot done, but their desks are like a huge pile of papers and whatever. Interestingly, the finding that conscientiousness is one of the best predictors of academic performance or workplace performance is very well established at this point. But if we look down at that next level, it looks like it's mostly due to industriousness and not orderliness. Orderliness can actually get in the way of people being productive, because they become too focused on details. And similarly, industriousness is associated with lower levels of anxiety and neuroticism. Orderliness is associated with higher levels of anxiety and neuroticism, especially if you control for industriousness.
So at the trait level, there's no correlation between the two, but then if you zoom in, you can see that the bidirectional.
No, on balance with conscientiousness, there is a negative correlation with neuroticism, and that's part of what produces the stability meta trait, that higher order factor, is that higher conscientiousness typically goes with lower neuroticism and also higher agreeableness. But if you take two people who have equal levels of industriousness, The one who is higher in orderliness will also tend to be higher in anxiety.
That makes sense. Do we have any idea of which direction it goes in? Because you could think if you're more anxious, you're gonna like look at the world and see more disorder and need to fix it. But you could also think something like if you are more orderly, that's going to cause you to be more anxious because you see disorder everywhere.
Right, because you'll have more error messages because you have stricter standards for how things should be compared to what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably goes in, I think it probably operates in both directions. Um, Understanding the exact patterns of causality and these kinds of correlational phenomena that we can't easily manipulate in the lab is, of course, difficult. And I think often there's going to be bidirectional causality in these kinds of situations, where both of the patterns you just described are probably in play. There's something similar that you see in associations between conscientiousness and intelligence, where it's been noted repeatedly that there's a weak negative correlation between intelligence and conscientiousness, but that seems to be basically driven entirely by orderliness. So if anything, for industriousness, there's maybe a slight positive correlation between industriousness and intelligence, but for orderliness, there's a negative correlation, and people have suggested that that is essentially a compensatory effect, where people who are less capable of dealing with complex information because they are less intelligent are therefore more motivated to be organized in order to essentially limit the complexity of the environment that they have to deal with.
And there's also a correlation between intelligence and openness. Now, is that more so driven by the intellect dimension?
Yeah, that's almost entirely driven by the intellect dimension. There seems to be a bit of a residual positive association between the openness aspect and verbal intelligence specifically, which is pretty interesting. Especially interesting in light of a study that recently came out, a large-scale genetic study that found that the difference between people's verbal and nonverbal abilities is associated. So people who have higher verbal relative to nonverbal, like regardless of what their absolute level of intelligence is, are more they're more likely to be artistically creative and also more at risk for certain kinds of mental disorder.
Interesting.
And just in general, so openness tends to be a risk factor for several kinds of mental health problems, whereas intellect is a protective factor.
Could that be openness being a risk factor because you're more likely to sort of step outside of the bounds of the norm if you're creative, and that can maybe just socially ostracize you and have all these indirect ways of influencing your mental health?
I mean, that could certainly be related. Something analogous to that is that intellect is positively associated with academic achievement, whereas openness is negatively associated. But especially if you look at them as simultaneous predictors, and I expect that's largely because the things that people high in openness are interested in tend to be things relating to artistic pursuits, where yes, you can get some credit in the academic world for you could be an art major, but it's less consistent with the general set of things that we ask for in terms of academic accomplishments. So there could be something social about that, but I suspect it's deeper than that too. I suspect that there are actually reasons related to underlying information processing. So openness is related to this tendency that's known as apophenia, which is to perceive patterns that aren't really there. And that could be something as simple as like, seeing faces in the clouds or, in the tree bark or whatever. But it can also be sort of incorrect causal beliefs, like, people who believe in astrology, for example. So there are all these kinds of everyday kinds of apophenia that lots of people experience. But then when you get to the extremes of that, you get to hallucinations and delusions, right, of a kind of clinical level that are associated with psychosis. But at any of those levels of severity, that basically reflects a balance between type 1 and type 2 errors. So people who are higher in openness are more likely to make these type 1 errors where they say something is there when it isn't. So a type 2 error is saying that something's not there when it is, and a type 1 error is saying something is there when it's not. And all organisms have to basically strike a balance between how sensitive do you want your pattern detection to be to make sure that you don't miss important things, but not so sensitive that you're constantly making wrong interpretations about what's actually there. So again, it's one of these kind of evolutionary trade-offs where you can see why variation is maintained.
So then among people high in openness, would you say that it's like a high risk, high reward evolutionary strategy where maybe if 90% of them are crazy, but 10% turn out to be some creative genius that win out in terms of like getting resources or status or reproductive success, it can be stable over time, even if the 90% are like struggling, starving artists.
Yeah, well, that's a very pessimistic view on it. My guess is that it's actually a lot better than 90-10 in terms of the motive toward human creativity. There are studies showing that artists, musicians, people who have this kind of creative success have more reproductive partners, or let's say mating partners anyway, than those who do not have those kinds of creative achievements. So, and of course, in addition to reproduction, there's just the benefit of being more creative and being able to solve unusual problems more readily. So I think one model that I've always liked of this is what's called a fitness cliff, where basically as you're getting more creative, you're getting a bit looser, especially if you've got the intelligence to go along with it. And remember that intelligence and creativity are positively correlated. Then you can afford to get pretty loose, but at some point you go over a cliff, and then it's no longer helping you from an evolutionary standpoint.
Is it also related to assertiveness?
Is what related to assertiveness?
Openness or creativity more generally?
Well, so openness and intellect both have some degree of relationship with extraversion, because that's what creates that higher plasticity factor. Mm-hmm. If we look at specific creative pursuits, really most of the variance seems to be coming from openness, except in performance-oriented domains of creativity, like acting or musical performance. Then we do tend to see also a bit of prediction from extraversion as well. Assertiveness, partly you get those benefits just more directly by being more persistent and more, let's say, energetic and going after the things that you want and going after possibilities, perceiving possibilities and then being motivated to pursue them.
We've talked about how all of these personality traits exist in the sense that they are latent variables that capture statistical covariance of a bunch of traits or behaviors. Now, on one hand, from like a neurobiological perspective, you might say, because they're capturing this statistical covariance, there has to be something biological going on. But then on the other hand, you might say something like, if it just seems to be correlational, you wouldn't necessarily expect to pinpoint a single system in the brain for like any personality trait. So I'm guessing it's very messy when you're looking at the neuroscience of it.
Yeah, there's a whole range of possibilities there, right? Like on the extreme end, it could be just that there are certain things about the social environment that encourage people who have one set of traits to have another, and that's what causes the covariation. It could be entirely environmental. Of course, we know that's not the case because all of these personality traits are substantially heritable. Right? So genetic variation between people predicts variation in these traits. So it's clear that there is something due to the underlying biological systems that are genetically influenced that is related to these traits. But then you're right. The question is, well, how straightforward are those underlying mechanisms? And I guess my theoretical perspective on this is sort of as a balance somewhere between, the pessimistic explanation or answer would be that for different people, different brain systems are causing these different patterns of behavior. There's not that much consistency in linking the way the brain does something to what the output is, and then the other opposite end would be for each one of these traits, we're going to be able to come up with easily one very specific set of neurovariables, probably in a single brain system, that is responsible. My perspective on this is that these things are going to be multiply determined. There are going to be a number of different biological parameters that are influencing each one of these broad patterns of behavior, but that they will probably be linked to relatively coherent functional systems that are designed to carry out certain evolutionarily important tasks. And I tend to think about those tasks from a cybernetic perspective, and cybernetics is the study of goal-directed systems that self-regulate via feedback processes. And so all organisms are cybernetic systems, and the brain has very well conserved subsystems that are designed to do things to allow us to pursue our goals effectively. Like the reward and punishment systems are very well conserved across, certainly across mammals, and even to other orders as well. But so let's say, for example, we think about the reward system. From a cybernetic perspective, a reward is a goal. Anything that the organism has adopted as a goal will be rewarding if we obtain it, or if we have cues that we are moving closer to obtaining it. And you need systems that are going to track progress toward goals and motivate pursuit of them. And so the way that I think about the big five is that each one of them can be kind of mapped onto some of these relatively large scale, well conserved evolutionarily brain systems.
Getting at the nature nurture question, how stable are these personality traits or cybernetic brain systems across the lifespan, and how much of the variance is explained by genes or environment?
Well, there are two different questions in there. So the question of proportion explained by genes or environment, we can ask that at any given age. And for a number of traits, like this is very well established with intelligence, for example, the heritability increases with age. So essentially, as the organism has a chance to interact with the environment and learn and develop, you get more and more influence of the genes relative to the environment, which might seem to be counterintuitive, because you might think that as you have more and more environmental experience, the environment is going to be more and more important. But it turns out that when you've got something like intelligence, which is about your capacity to model the world accurately in terms of causal relations, logically coherent patterns, that in fact the ability of a, let's say, more efficient brain to learn these things over time leads to higher levels of heritability with age. With a lot of the personality traits, it's a little bit more ambiguous. Some of them seem to maybe actually decline with inheritability with age. I think we have some measurement issues in early life that are so far have prevented us from having a particularly clear picture about this. But okay, let's just for a minute focus on heritability in adulthood. So you will commonly see estimates that the range of heritability for the big five is in the range of about 40 to 60% for adults. But that is too low an estimate, because questionnaire measurement is not as precise as something like an IQ test. There are various biases that people have when they answer IQ tests. When they answer personality questionnaires, whether they know it or not. And there are a few studies that have used better measurement by asking not only the person to rate themselves, but other people who know the person to rate them as well. And then you can basically triangulate among the ratings from these different raters of a single individual. And in studies that have done that, the heritability estimates for the big five are in the range of 60 to 80% for adults, which interestingly is basically the same range that you see for estimates of the heritability of IQ. But now the important thing is that what people often don't understand is that even with relatively high heritabilities like that, there's plenty of opportunity for the environment to shape people's personality. And so personality does still change over the course of adulthood. So what we know in terms of this basic stability over the lifetime question is that personality is least stable in, if we're thinking about rank order, like, I'm more extroverted than he is, and he's more extroverted than that other person is. If we think about the rank order, the correlation among people, then least stable in early childhood, and basically just keeps increasing in stability until you get to sort of middle age, and then it plateaus for a while, and then it starts to decline again when you get to old age. Let's say 65, 70, you start to see a bit of a decline in stability again, which is probably related to random illness, degenerative conditions, these kinds of things. Now, if we think about not rank order stability, but sort of absolute levels or average levels in the population, then you actually see that the most dramatic rates of change are in adolescence. But the reason that doesn't lead to a decreased rank order stability is that pretty much everybody is changing in the same way, or is tending to change in the same way. So it's funny when you look at these plots of the averages in large samples, and you go from, like age 10 years old to, let's say, 20 or 25, what you see is that once you hit puberty, agreeableness and conscientiousness just basically take this huge dive until you get to age 15 or so, basically the nadir of human personality. And parents with teenagers won't be surprised to hear that. And then as you get up, back into the early 20s, it rises up again and gets back to the level of where you were when you were 10, and then even higher than that, for the population on average. So there's a lot of change going on in adolescence.
I wonder how much that has to do with hormonal changes and changes in risk reward processing in the brain, which is exactly what I study.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, during
yes,
adolescence.
I'm sure. Well, anything that's due to genetic maturational processes in puberty is obviously going to be largely governed by hormones. So yes, I'm sure that is the explanation, and certainly you do see that this. I mean, as you know, this change in the risk sensitivity and reward-seeking behavior in adolescence, and so you could think of basically like increases. So interestingly, you don't really see increases in sort of general levels of extraversion, but you do see risk increases in this more specific facet of excitement seeking or thrill seeking that you were mentioning earlier in adolescence. And you certainly see these declines in agreeableness and conscientiousness that would help put the brake on that kind of risky reward seeking behavior.
And the biggest sex difference I know of in personality is women tend to be more agreeable than men, right? Does that
and neuroticism?
begin at puberty?
So those two are fairly similar in magnitude. That women are higher in neuroticism, women are higher in neuroticism, and women are higher in agreeableness.
Is that a sex difference you see in prepubescent children, or would it kick off as the hormonal changes of puberty begin?
You see both of those differences even pre-puberty. But especially the neuroticism difference gets really magnified when you get into puberty. So even as young as like 3 or 4 years old, if you look at the frequency of like, say, diagnoses with anxiety problems, you already see a sex difference. But when you get to puberty, yes, you basically see women have a real spike in neuroticism, and boys stay fairly similar. Yeah.
That's interesting, because from some of the animal research I know on risk reward processing, like how testosterone influences seeking behaviors, whether seeking is like for food reward or sex or whatever, where males tend to be more seeking, and that goes up with testosterone levels in either sex. That in before puberty, there doesn't seem to be much of a big sex difference in that. So that's making me wonder if in humans, the agreeableness difference you see in prepubescent children might be more socialized as
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. But at the same time, agreeableness, again, has to do more with the degree to which you are cooperative with other people and which you are, tending to be altruistic. And so, agreeableness is going to help put the brakes potentially on that kind of reward-seeking behavior if it's likely to hurt other people. But I wouldn't say it's not sort of directly reflective of it.
The sex differences that you see make sense from an evolutionary perspective, where the agreeable, like maternal care type behavior, it makes sense why females would evolve more of that. And then I guess neuroticism could be also related to that maternal care dimension, in the sense of like you might be more threat sensitive if you're taking care of vulnerable children, and if you're smaller physically and more vulnerable compared to men.
Yeah, right. There's the physical vulnerability. There is also, just the question, the idea that men are more expendable, right? So if you need to repopulate, let's say you're going to kill off all but one of a given sex, you would definitely want it to be the men rather than the women, right? Because that one man could repopulate the whole tribe. Whereas women have much more serious limitations on how many offspring they can produce. So yeah, from an evolutionary perspective, men are more expendable, so it makes sense for them to be more risk-taking and less sensitive to threat.
So you would then expect there to be a larger sex difference, perhaps an extroversion, where men are more risk-taking, but we don't seem to see that, right?
Interestingly, we do, but you have to look at it at the right level of the personality hierarchy. So that's one of the things that's useful about my 10-factor model. When you look at that level of the 10 factors, you actually see sex differences in every one of the big five, but they cancel out in several of the dimensions. So men are higher in assertiveness, but women are higher in enthusiasm. So women are more sociable and experience more positive emotions, but men are more assertive. And it's the assertiveness that's more associated with that willingness to take risks. Now, I know I was earlier talking about the fact that excitement seeking is associated with both enthusiasm and assertiveness, and I think that's because a lot of the kinds of excitement that people like is not necessarily that dangerous, right? We're not necessarily talking about, hang gliding. We could be talking about going out to a rave, and both of those would be forms of excitement seeking.
Okay, so if you see sex differences in all of them and they cancel out, for conscientiousness, I'm guessing it would be that women are higher in orderliness and men higher in industriousness, which seems to fit the stereotype, although why would that evolve?
I'm not sure. I mean, you're correct in your guess. Basically what you see, and I can't remember, a couple of these one of these only appears if, I think it's that one, if you control for the other one. So what you see just at the zero order is that women are more orderly and neither sex is more industrious. But if you look at the variance that's specific to industriousness controlling for orderliness, then men are higher in industriousness. So in other words, if you take a group of men and a group of women who are equal in their orderliness, the men will tend to be more industrious. And why, I think for these same reasons of limiting threat, we can imagine why women might be higher in orderliness. And the men's tendency toward higher industriousness would probably be linked to that tendency toward assertiveness, basically toward that exploratory reward-seeking tendency, because industriousness is one of the major ways that you accomplish things.
I'm not sure how you can really generalize personality to non-human species, but I do remember reading at some point about the big five applied to primates, and the idea, maybe it was chimpanzees, and the idea was not only were the big five replicated, but there was also a sixth dominance personality trait that they say we don't have in humans.
Yeah, so there is a lot of research now on personality in other species, even if that sounds like a funny way to label it. But of course, there are persistent individual differences in behavior in all species. So that's what we mean by personality in humans. There's no real harm in calling it personality in other species as well. Many of the big five show analogous factors in other species that have been studied. It's a bit difficult because it's hard to get large samples and it's hard to get necessarily the same kind of comprehensive assessment of specific traits that you can easily get with a questionnaire with people. So, I would take all of this with a little bit of a grain of salt, but dominance is most closely linked to assertiveness in people. So there's a tradition of interpersonal theory in psychology that basically maps overt social behavior into two dimensions, one of dominance or status and one of affiliation or love or nurturing. They have various different labels. And so you can have then a two-dimensional space created by those axes. And it turns out that the four aspects, two for extroversion and two for agreeableness, map perfectly onto that interpersonal circumplex, they call it. It's a sort of circular two-dimensional space. And assertiveness basically corresponds to dominance. Now, you run into confusion in psychology because a lot of people use the word dominance to refer to aggression. But obviously in ethology, dominance does not refer to aggression. It refers to position in a hierarchy of access to resources. So dominance just means having greater access to resources relative to other members of the social group. And that can be achieved in various species, not only through aggression, but also through coalition building or, formation of allyships or whatever. So the long and the short of it is that there may be a more prominent dimension of dominance within chimpanzees because that's such a kind of central component of their behavior. but we have the same basic components that would make up that trait that they do. We just exercise dominance a lot less through aggression and a lot more through, assertive and organizational behavior, let's say.
Do you think it's useful to understand your own personality in detail in the way through the 10 facets we've been talking about, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the better you understand yourself, the better you understand both your strengths and your limitations, the better you understand, why you experience the world the way that you do, why you experience it differently from the way that other people experience it. So yeah, I'm a big believer in the ancient Greek maxim, know thyself.
Know thyself. Actually, I should have phrased that question scientifically. Do we have evidence that if maybe you could have like one group of people who takes a personality test and then receives detailed information about what this means, and then another group that just has some control task, and then you follow up with them maybe a few months later and see if anything improves in their lives? Do you know of research like that?
That's a really interesting question. So there is certainly the research that I do not know about is research showing that people who have a more accurate understanding of their own personalities tend to have fewer psychological problems in various domains.
And is that even if you're like highly neurotic, but then you're self-aware about your neurosis?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I mean, because of course you'd want to control for the levels of neuroticism when you were considering the benefit of the self-knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I think that, yes, as long as you have the appropriate controls, that you will see that there is a benefit to understanding yourself, even if you're not happy about the conclusions that you're coming to. And then the other domain where this has been looked at is in clinical context, right, in therapy, that helping people to understand their own problems is the basic idea of insight, right, clinical insight. And it's generally predictive of better prognosis to have greater insight. In terms of actual experimental studies, giving people personality feedback and then looking at the results, I'm not thinking of any offhand. I would be amazed if that hadn't been done, but I don't know or remember at the moment.
Let's close with this, Colin. What are you currently working on or most excited about?
Oh, well, I'm always working on a number of different projects. I'll mention just two right now. So I've been working on with a philosopher here at the University of Minnesota, Valerie Tiberius. I've been working on extending my cybernetic theory to encompass a new psychological theory of well-being. It's basically the implications of the cybernetic theory for how we should conceive of well-being and how people might improve their well-being. And that just, our initial theoretical presentation of that just came out in Personality and Social Psychology Review in the last couple of months. And we're currently working on developing instruments to measure our well-being in the way that fits with our conception of it. And then on the other side, the more neuroscience side of things, I've been really interested in trying to understand the neural basis of conscientiousness. So for extraversion, it's pretty clear it's linked to the function of the reward system. For neuroticism, threat and punishment systems. With agreeableness, we have some pretty good evidence it's related to systems involved in empathy and theory of mind, the capacity to understand and reason about other people's mental states. Conscientiousness has been a bit more of a mystery, but I think we have a pretty good lead, let's say, that there is a particular large-scale brain network called the salience or ventral attention network that is involved in I think a good way to characterize it would be as involved in prioritizing goals effectively, like paying attention to what is salient and directing attention away from distractors and toward goal-relevant stimuli. And we've got some evidence, actually some pretty good evidence at this point across 3 different large samples of associations of connectivity in that network with conscientiousness. And we're starting to think about how to get at that association potentially with some task-based MRI.
Is that related to inhibitory control?
Yes. So that network is the major network that is involved in inhibitory control. Yeah, when people think about things like, a stop signal task. That's right.
That makes sense. That's very exciting. Thank you very much for your time, Colin.
Yes. Well, thanks for having me on. This has been fun.